All right, so we're on chapter 18, and if you remember, we started in chapter 17 of your textbook, and chapter 18 is titled The West on the Eve of a New World Order. And so by West, and this is going by the old maps, we're referring to Western Europe, and usually by association North America. So, what do we define as West? Well, it depends on what you define as the center of the earth. Most ancient civilizations define themselves as the center of the earth. China called themselves the Middle Kingdom. Why? Well, because they thought they were the middle of the earth. Mediterranean in Greek means middle of the earth. Middle earth, to be exact. And so many people considered themselves the middle, the center of civilization. And, of course, Western Europe was no exception to this. So what we're looking at here is one of my favorite paintings. And I mean, when I was in school, in history and in high school, I had a pretty boring teacher, so I thumbed through and looked at the pictures, usually just got bored and had nothing else to do. We didn't have smartphones. And this was always the picture that just caught my attention. Who can tell me what we're looking at? Does anybody know what this famous painting is of? The French Revolution. Very good, Nick. So, in fact, at the beginning of the French Revolution, there was a huge prison called the Bastille. And the Bastille held political prisoners. Now, this wasn't just your ordinary prison like I robbed a bank and got thrown in the Bastille. No, the Bastille was reserved especially for people that spoke out against the royal family or the king, or complained about society, or were seen as dangerous to the stability of the nation. And so storming the palace, or storming the prison, was quite a violent affair. I mean, they shot cannons, they killed guards, and then finally the warden of the prison realized that fighting wasn't going to do him any good, and so, in an act of desperation, surrendered. And he went out to the crowd, waving the white flag, and they ripped him limb from limb. So the French Revolution is quite a violent affair. But before we get to that, all the good darkness of the French Revolution and the follow-up of Napoleon and so forth, I want to talk about some significant changes that were happening in Western Europe. And in your upper-level history classes, if you ever decide to go deep with this stuff at the university, you can take a class called The History of Scientific Revolutions. It's fascinating. If you don't want to take the class or don't want to deal with all the work involved, I highly recommend a book by Thomas Kuhn called The History of Scientific Revolutions. And it deals with, in much greater detail, what I'm about to share with you in a few slides. So first off, the scientific revolution ultimately challenged conceptions and beliefs about the nature of the external world that had become dominant by the late Middle Ages. Now first, we're going to start with a revolution in astronomy. Medieval philosophers had used the ideas of Aristotle, Ptolemy, who was considered the greatest astronomer of antiquity, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and Christianity to form the Ptolemaic or geocentric theory of the universe. Now, in this conception, the universe was seen as a series of concentric spheres with a fixed or motionless Earth at its center. And so what that means is it was believed, and this was the most popular idea of the time, that our universe moved because it was attached to these invisible spheres made of crystal. They're called the crystalline spheres. Now, the spheres were transparent, meaning you cannot see them, obviously, otherwise you'd see these giant spheres in the universe, in the sky. And they had a fixed or motionless Earth at the center. Again, this is called a geocentric theory, geo for Earth, meaning it was the idea, the concept that we were the center of the universe. So not unlike ancient civilizations that placed themselves at the center of the world, we also were so arrogant that we placed ourselves at the center of existence. Now the heavenly bodies, believed to number in 10, these were the 10 visible objects, were seen as pure orbs of light, and they were embedded into the moving concentric spheres. Now, working outward from the earth, meaning that, of course, all of these are moving around the earth, the first 8 were the moon, which they believed was a planet, or they could not distinguish between the moon and different planets, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and even the fixed stars. Now, you'll find evidence of this geocentric theory in many different ancient texts. For example, if you read the Old Testament carefully, there's a few stories in the book of Joshua, I believe, where Joshua was fighting some Philistines or some bad guys or whoever, and he was running low on daylight. And he wanted to have time to kill all the bad guys, and so he asked God to extend the day. And according to the text, it says that God stopped the sun and reversed the sun X amount of hours. And in order for that to be accurate, the sun would have to be moving around the earth. And that's a classic geocentric misconception. Now, the ninth sphere, which of the fixed stars, which was moving, and the 10th sphere on the very, very far edges of the universe was called the prime mover. The prime mover meaning that it's on the outside of whatever this mysterious machine that is the universe, and it's the mover. It's whatever is moving all planets. And beyond the 10th sphere was heaven. And this is where it was believed that God and angels and, dead people who live good lives, etc. live. And so, thus God was seen at the end of the universe, and humans were seen at the center. Now, one of the first famous astronomers to question this theory was named Nicholas Copernicus. He was from Poland. He was a mathematician. And he felt that this geocentric system failed. It didn't play out correctly. For example, when he observed the movements of these heavenly bodies, he noticed there were problems. Well, for one, the sun isn't always in the same place. As we're moving around, as we're rotating around the sun in an elliptical shape, not a perfect circle. And so, of course, as our planet is moving, etc., and it's in different places in respect to the sun, we have our seasons. And so the sun is literally visible during less hours in the winter, etc. And so the geocentric theory just failed to explain all of these factors. And so he came up with the heliocentric theory. And the heliocentric theory, known more commonly as the sun-centered theory, places the sun at the center of the universe. And it was seen as a more accurate explanation. Now, Copernicus argued the sun was motionless and actually at the center of the universe. Well, now we know it's at the center of the galaxy, but it's not at the center of all things. There are many suns, many different galaxies. Well, what is so neat about this is that Copernicus was able to demonstrate that the planets revolved around the sun, and that Earth was simply one of these planets. Now, Copernicus did not actually reject the idea of Ptolemy's planetary motion. This is something that's going to be solved later. The question always was, how do the planets move? And no one really knew. It was a great mystery, you know. Were there angels with flaming chariots pulling these things, circling around the universe? I don't know. Did God blow and make them move? Was that the primogeniture, the prime mover? Was there a physical being moving? And what explained that these planets moved? And Copernicus didn't have an answer for this. All he knew was they did move, and that they moved around the sun, not the earth. Now, Johann Kepler was the one who finally came up with how they moved. And when he finally figured out how they moved, he was able to confirm Copernicus's theory. He was like, oh, this is how it goes. This is why they move. This explains that the sun is at the center of the universe. Now, these people were, of course, reading each other's work. And, in kind of the spirit of Facebook pages, they commented on each other's work. And they would have copies of each other's books, and they would make notes in the margins and all over the place. And so Kepler revised Copernicus's theory, showing that the orbits of the planets around the sun were not circular, but elliptical, like I was telling you. And the sun, again, at one focus of the ellipsis rather than at the center. So an ellipsis is like an oval. And the sun is not actually the center, according to Kepler's theory. He's merely saying that it is at one focus. And so if ever you look at or go to a planetarium or you see one of those old kind of motion planet things, they're really cool. But it's much better to see a visual of this. But the point is, it starts to raise important questions. For example, what are the planets made of? Are they made of earth, the same as ours? Are they rock? Are they gold? Are they diamonds? Now, the next person we're going to talk about is an Italian scientist. I'm sure you've heard of this man. Galileo Galilei, the most famous character within the story. He taught math and was the first European to make systematic observations of the heavens by means of a telescope, and this brought in a whole new age of astronomy. So the amazing thing to me is that Aristotle was able to come up with basic elements that comprised life. He was able to develop theories about planetary motion, though they were not accurate, with nothing but the naked eye. Copernicus was able to use math to figure out with the naked eye that actually the sun was at the center of this motion and not the planet Earth. And that's amazing to me. Now, what's equally exciting is when these brilliant minds finally get a hold of a telescope and see with clarity and understand the truth behind so many of these theories that were merely academic. For example, Galileo turned his telescope to the skies and made a remarkable series of discoveries. He found the moon had mountains on it. And in fact, some planets had more than one moon. Jupiter had 4. And that the sun was not this perfect giant ball of fire. Ancient civilizations revered the sun as the most powerful of gods. In the Old Testament, it said that God has a radiance, that if you stare at him, you will go blind. It's comparing God to the sun. Galileo found the sun was imperfect. It had blemishes. It had spots on it. Now imagine, you've lived your whole life thinking the sun is this perfect, heavenly, everlasting fire, lit by God to burn the ages. And someone says it's imperfect. It's a revolution. That's why we call it scientific revolution. It's a revolution in the way we think. It's changing life forever. Now, Galileo published his revelations in a book called The Starry Messenger. I wouldn't recommend reading it. It's definitely not light reading. However, if physics is your thing, tell us how it goes. I want to hear about it because I haven't tried it myself. Now, of course, you probably heard the story how the Catholic Church condemned Copernicus and his theories, and he ordered Galileo to abandon this notion of heliocentric. And the church attacked this system because, like I just pointed out, it threatens Scripture. If Galileo is right, there are verses in the Bible that are wrong. It's heavy stuff, right? This isn't religion class, but I just want you to know that there are some people that were very upset by that. And, of course, the Catholic Church was very upset by that because they have a huge stake in being right. Because if they are wrong, they lose all their power. Now, if the heavens are no longer a spiritual world, but a world of matter, the heavens, and I mean, when I say the heavens, I mean outer space. But if outer space is not actually where God physically lives, well, then where does he live? And the church has been telling people wrong all the time. For example, Paul describes a spiritual experience in the epistles in the New Testament. And he says, I was caught up into the third heaven. And I always used to be fat. I was like, what does he mean by third heaven? So I looked it up and read about it. And they said, well, the first heaven is the air you breathe, the sky, what you can see. The second heaven is seen as whatever is kind of outside of the realm of earth, the stars and planets. And the third heaven is where that primogeniture is, the prime mover. That's called the third heaven. And so when Paul described being caught up into the third heaven, it's like being kidnapped by aliens. He's not just going to outer space. He's transcending all of those crystalline spheres. And if that's not accurate, then that's a bummer for a lot of people. And so again, the church has a major problem with this idea. Now, through the 1630s and 40s, most astronomers had come to accept that the new conception of the universe was the right one. The math plays out. It works. And so the learned community were not disputing this. It was the religious community. Just wanted to let that sink in. So the scientific community had accepted Galileo's theories. Now, he would be considered one of the greatest geniuses of the scientific revolution, but not perhaps the greatest. In fact, that distinction may lie with an Englishman, Sir Isaac Newton. Now, Sir Isaac Newton was a teacher at Cambridge. His major work is called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. It's known simply as the Principia. And in the Principia, Newton defined the three laws of motion that govern the planetary bodies, as well as the objects on Earth. And this is still studied in physics and in thermodynamics. This is, and his work on why things move is still, and again, he was writing in the 1700s, and this is still the just generally accepted theory of why things move. Now, crucial to his argument is the concept of the universal law of gravitation. And this explains that an object has an attraction equal to its mass. You ever heard the joke, your mama's so fat she got orbits? Well, that's a joke based on Newton's law of thermodynamics, that a large enough object has a gravitational force. Small objects have a small amount of gravitational force. Large objects, I just ate a whole pizza, it was awesome, have a large amount of gravitational force. And it fits. The sun is the largest object in this galaxy, and it makes perfect sense, according to the law of thermodynamics, that things would move around it. Now, Newton was able to explain that not just the sun, not just the earth, but literally every object has a small amount of attraction. And this is called gravity. Now, was Newton sitting under a tree like we heard in elementary school and an apple hit him on the head? Maybe. I don't know. Last fall I was running and some acorn just knocked me upside the head and I discovered gravity. Awesome. But what's really brilliant about this is he was able to explain how that works. Everyone knew gravity is a thing, right? From the first time some idiot jumps off a cliff. Yes, gravity is a thing. He wasn't demonstrating that, oh yeah, by the way, idiots fall off cliffs. No, he simply explained how it worked. Now, Newton demonstrated through the math, and again the numbers are far beyond me, that all motion in the universe operates by this central principle. And that's so cool. He takes something mysterious and unknown, and he makes it known. And that's what's changing the world, folks. And this creates a whole new story. And that's where your book says it creates a new cosmology in which the universe was seen as one regulated machine. And what it means is now we have a new way of explaining things. This is called a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift means that you saw the world one way, and now you see things a different way. Because now everything can be explained. Not everything, but many things can be explained where they had not been previously. Newton called this the world machine. Today we simply call it the laws of physics. And he said that things operate by these natural laws. And this would be the prevailing concept of thought until Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. And we're not going to get into relativity in this course unless maybe we get lucky at the end and we get that far, but just know that he was another game changer. Moving on. We have to ask the question, since this is world history. This is not Western Civ, this is not European history, this is world history. And so there is that question. Why didn't this happen in China? Well, they were the most populated country. They were the oldest civilization. You would think they would have the smart people. Well, in the Middle Ages, China had been the most technologically advanced civilization in the world. Now, after about 1500, that distinction did pass to Western Europe. And one of the essays you could choose to read for this week for your forum it's called The Scientific Revolution. So if you're like, hey, I want to get into this more, then choose that one. Now, historians aren't quite sure why. You could theorize that the sense of order in Chinese society contrasted with the competitive spirit in Europe. So that while in China you have this filial piety, Confucianism, everything goes in a communal way, to the European Western concept of we're all individuals and we're all better than each other. Maybe that could have something to do with why, so maybe it's a cultural thing. Others have emphasized China's ideological viewpoint that favored living in harmony with nature rather than trying to dominate it. So maybe they were just arguing that, well, maybe China just didn't care. That they were more concerned about living with nature rather than trying to explain every detail of it. And some have even suggested that the Confucian civil service system put the best and brightest into government positions instead of scientific ones. Now, the next revolution I want to talk about is the Enlightenment. This one, to me, is even more exciting. Because this is a revolution not just in science, but in life. People, partly as a result of scientific discoveries. For example, Newton was the first to suggest that there was not an angel pushing planets, but that there was a logical reason for why planets move. And so for many questions, God had been removed from the equation. Now, the Enlightenment was a movement of intellectuals. These had been influenced by the accomplishments of the scientific revolution. Many of these people advocated the application of the scientific method to the understanding of all life. Well, if the world makes sense according to natural laws, why can't we make sense of our own lives? You know, I don't like to talk politics because it just leaves people angry for the most part. I don't engage in Facebook. Sometimes I indulge myself and read angry comments, but I try to stay away from it. Why? Because no one really goes to political debates to listen and learn. People go to vent and fight. And so I just don't engage. But when people engage me, I like to ask them, well, how would you set it up? You know, okay, well, our country sucks, right? Well, you know, whatever. So how would you fix it? And typically on both sides of the issues, people have similar solutions. And they typically revolve around what that person views as a common sense solution. And, you know, don't you just wish we could all just get together and say, wow, that would be cool if we could all just rationally discuss and come up with a good idea to fix this political garbage that we've got right now. And I'm not going to say that these guys had it figured out. You know, there's plenty of brilliant people today that would do the same thing given the opportunity. But that's what many of these people were trying to do, is to subject life to the same rational, scientific way of thinking as if we were free of all traditions. You know, if you would set up life however you wanted, what would you do? Oh, I'd end world hunger. You communist! Oh, well, I would make sure everybody's happy. Communist! Oh, I'd make sure everybody got an education. Communist! Oh, I'd help the world. Communist. No, you know, again, it's against our tradition. And so many things fly in the way of our already understood, perceived ways of life. And so one of the neat things here as we start to get into these thinkers is that they were trying to say, okay, well, what if, let's just pretend that no idea is too crazy. And so the first guy I want to get into is my favorite. His name's John Locke. And you may have heard of him. He was the bald guy on Lost. You remember kind of the mystic on Lost? And okay, watch the show if you didn't like it. Whatever. Well, John Locke came up with this idea that people had the right to determine for themselves how they want to live. We call it freedom. He called it the self-determination of man. And he explained this in his essay called Concerning Human Understanding. Locke denied the existence of innate ideas, and that means that we were born with certain preconceived notions, or he denied even the concept of original sin. He said we are born with a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, a blank mind, that we all start fresh. He said that's how life begins, that we're not born condemned to hell, as some would have us believe, but that we're born with a blank slate. And I want to quote from the book. He said, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it? By that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety. Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word: from experience. Our observation employed either about external sensible objects, about the internal operations of our minds perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that which supplies our understanding with all the materials of thinking." If you got nothing out of that, it's that word experience. He said that's where we become who we are going to be. He's a behaviorist. He would have agreed with B.F. Skinner, saying that we are the product of our environment, not the product of our genetic code. And by denying innate or born ideas, Locke implied that people were molded by their environment, by whatever they perceived through their senses from their surrounding world. And he believed that if we could change the environment that people were raised up in, we could better society. I mean, guys, I've been a teacher for about a decade, and I can tell you, there's a difference between the children of good families with loving homes and good parents who care for their children. Rich, poor, not so much, but it's the caring. It's the nurturing environment. There's a big difference between those children and where they wind up. And children who don't have those advantages. Now, again, my wife is from a, interesting family. It doesn't always work that way. I don't know your family situations. Again, we've all overcome obstacles in our life. And surely for many of us it's family obstacles. But the question is, what if we can better someone's chances of being successful by giving them positive experiences from birth? And it's a what if. Like, instead of saying, so-and-so was born to so-and-so, that parent's an idiot, child will be an idiot. No, I don't think that way. I hope you don't. Because he's saying there's hope. There's hope for society. Now, we're going to discuss that a little more later. Next, I want to get into a group of people, and for the most part they were wealthy French landowners, who called themselves the Philosophs. They weren't all French, but they were all, in some sense of the term, philosophers. Now, the Philosophs were a collection of writers, teachers, journalists, economists, scientists, etc., just educated people. And the Philosophs affected intellectuals everywhere. Now, for these people, they believed that it was not enough to simply discuss these ideas, but to actually change the world with their ideas. Now, for example, when we start getting into Locke and self-determination and Montesquieu, separation of powers, and all these different people, My hope is that we will kind of gain an understanding of the philosophy behind the great country that we live in. What if we could go back to the beginning and start writing the Constitution all over again and start thinking about if we could set up the world however we wanted, how would we do it? These are the people that came up with those ideas, and that's what makes them special. You see, over the course of nearly 100 years, this period called the Enlightenment evolved with each succeeding generation, becoming more radical as new thinkers started coming up with even crazier ideas. And the three main ones that we're going to focus on for the next few minutes are Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Diderot. And we'll get as far as we can with time allowing. The chapter carries us all the way to Napoleon. I don't know if I'll get that far. I spent like 10 hours typing out this lesson. But what I don't get to with you guys, I'll post online, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. Now, the Baron Montesquieu came from the French nobility. In his most famous work, called The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu attempted to apply the scientific method to the comparative study of governments to ascertain the, quote, natural laws governing the social and political relationship of human beings. And so if you ever wondered, why couldn't we put a scientist in charge? This was the guy. He was like, well, if the heavens themselves operate according to a common sense, rational, predictable model, maybe civilization can be studied and modeled in a similar fashion. Now, when Montesquieu began to study monarchies, that is, a society based on a king and queen and ruling family, he used England as his example. And when he analyzed the English Constitution, he made his greatest contribution to political thought. He discovered that checks and balances achieved by a means of separation of powers, which served as a limit on each other, provided the greatest freedom and security for a state. And this became the basis of the branches of our government. Now, Montesquieu was quite brilliant. And what he said was, if we put one idiot in charge, that guy will muck everything up, go to war with France, and we'll all die, and we'll all be in debt, the ones that live. So we can't trust one idiot. What about three? And what if each are competing for power? What if, right? And this guy hates this guy who hates this guy, but they all need the vote of the people to stay in power. And so they'll be constantly seeking to usurp power from one another. And through a bit of friendly competition, or not so friendly competition, as election season's looming, then we'll get the best, is the hope. And that the three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial, that each serve as a check on one another, will each work against each other to ensure that neither branch becomes corrupt. And that's Montesquieu in a nutshell. The next is Voltaire, and a concept known as Deism. Now, if you're a Christian, another word for that is a theist. Now, not all Christians are theists. Not all theists are Christians, but all Christians are theists. For example, a Muslim would be a theist, a Jew would be a theist. All that means is someone who believes in God. And it doesn't necessarily mean Allah, God, or Jehovah, God. It just means a God, a theist. Now, Voltaire considered him a deist. Deism is slightly different than your conventional religion. Deism is based on the concept that God started this whole show and then for whatever reason is not involved. Many people call this the Divine Watchmaker. And for Voltaire, this explained the mystery of how this place got to be what it is. You know, we weren't yet to evolution, we weren't yet to Big Bang, so for him, all those things were still a mystery. And his resolution of those mysteries was that, well, some being came and set it all up, and then I sure hadn't seen him in a while. So he must not be involved in our lives. And that's called deism. Now, where this comes in to play in regards to politics is that Voltaire was a vocal critic of traditional religion. He wasn't the live and let live type, the quiet agnostic. No, he was an angry agnostic. And as he grew older, he got angrier. You know, he lived out the persona of angry old man. In fact, I want to quote Voltaire. He says, and I quote, "Crush the infamous thing." The infamous thing being religious fanaticism, intolerance, and superstition. Now, throughout his life, Voltaire championed not only religious tolerance, but also deism. Again, the idea that I told you about. And once God wound the clock and set up the laws, he left it to run. Now, the next person I want to talk about is Diderot. He became a writer so he could be free to study the subjects and languages that he chose. And one of his favorite topics was Christianity. And he condemned it as fanatical and unreasonable. Now, his most famous contribution to moving things forward was an encyclopedia. The first real Wikipedia, if you will. And it was called the Classified Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts, and Trades. It had 28 volumes and was the first attempt at an exhaustive compendium of knowledge that he considered the great work of his life. Its purpose was to change the general way of thinking and would become a weapon in the crusade against the old French society. Many people contributed, just like an early Wikipedia, if you will. It wasn't just one writer. Anyone who was knowledgeable in any particular field could submit articles, and he would collect them, just like Wikipedia. Now, we're moving towards a new science of man. The Enlightenment belief that Newton's scientific methods could be used to discover natural laws underlying all areas of human life led to the emergence of what these people began to call the science of man. And what I mean by that is, what if we could study the way that we live and that we interact with each other, and what if we could look at it in a purely cold, methodical way and come up with, based on scientific principles, the best way to all live together? The most rational approach to politics yet. Now, Plato attempted this with the Republic. His conclusion of a life study on society and civilizations was that democracy didn't work. It turns to anarchy. That nothing works perfectly. But his conclusion was that an enlightened, wise philosopher king who was already rich and didn't need or want the power of and pleasure of anything. He had to be old because he didn't need to care about worldly pleasures anymore. He had to be rich because he didn't need to want anything. And he had to be good. But in Plato's mind, that's as good as it gets. And now here's the same question being revisited in a more modern time. The next person I want to discuss is Adam Smith. Adam Smith was viewed as one of the founders of the discipline of economics, and he believed that individuals should be free to pursue their own economic self-interest. He is considered widely to be the author of Capitalism. He believed in laissez-faire economics. In fact, he basically defined it, that the state should in no way interrupt the free play of natural economic forces by imposing government regulations on the economy, but should leave it alone. Basically, he's arguing that government gets in the way of free enterprise. This concept is called laissez-faire economics. In Smith's view, the government had only three basic functions. Number one, an army. Number two, police. And number three, construction of public works. And really these are just roads and canals and things that individuals could not afford but collectively could pay for. Now, by the late 1760s, the next generation of philosophers began to move even further. And one of the people in this later Enlightenment generation was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And his major work is called The Discourse on the Origins of the Inequality of Mankind. Rousseau argued that people had adopted laws and governors in order to preserve their private property, and in the process had become slaves to the government. This is kind of based on observation of the old feudal system. When you had Vikings, and we learned about them in ancient world history, Vikings were really scary people. Mongols were even scarier. They would show up outside of cities and butcher men, women, children. They would kill the dogs, and then they would dig them up and kill them again. I mean, they were just nasty people. So to protect themselves, excuse me, to protect themselves from these nasty people, they would find whoever had a castle, and whoever had a big army with lots of weapons. The guy with the castle with a big army and lots of weapons would say, "Come with me if you want to live." And then the people would. And they would go hide in the castle during times of danger. And then when the bad guys would go away, that same guy would say, "Do what I say if you want to live." And they would do what he said, and they would work. And so what Rousseau is arguing is that these same people that ran to the castles became slaves to the master of the castle. And so what he's arguing is that we've given this awesome power to our government, and we've traded our freedom in return. Now again, it's not all bad news. What then? How do we get our freedom back? You know, it's like, now that I think about it, I'm like, wow, that sucks. Kind of, we've done that. Well, how do we get our freedom back? Well, and if you really want to get into the details, read his book, The Social Contract. Rousseau found an answer. He said that if society voluntarily agrees to be governed by a consensus or a vote, each individual might have a society or might have a particular will contrary to the general will, meaning that we may all have different beliefs on things. But if the individual puts his self-interest above the general will, that he should be forced to go along with the general will. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. See, for example, in the social contract, if I liked murdering people. If, not that I would, but if that were my hobby, well, to live in a society, I'm going to have to give up that hobby because that's not going to work. Just, it's not, period. So I would have to, and if I refuse to, go along with the general will of the people to not murder one another, then I will need to be forced to go along with it. And that's reasonable to us. It's like if you have axe murderer chopping heads off, well, we want that guy locked up. He does not need to be out in the public world doing axe murderer things, but to a lesser degree. If we are to agree to laws, then we have to agree to abide by them. I do student government at the high school, and we just drafted and signed a constitution. We came up with an attendance policy, and we did so together. And I did so because without a constitution last year, we had people abuse the system and start skipping. We had to kick 2 people out, and it wasn't a pleasant experience. And so to safeguard the sanctity of our little tiny club, together we created a set of rules that we have agreed to live by. And we called it a constitution, just like what this man's advocating. Now, from that set of rules, well, I mean, I can't promise that everyone's always going to want to obey those rules. Some people will want to do their own thing. Oh, man, Wednesday's coming up. We got our meeting. Oh, I'm going to go to the movies. I don't want to go to the meeting. Well, again, they must submit to the general will or be forced to. In this case, forced to would mean they would lose their membership in the club. So that's a big concept. That's called the social contract. And it's the essence of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The nation of the people, by the people, for the people. That our society is a social contract. Now, another of these influential works was about education. See, Thomas Jefferson once said that the only true corrective of the abusive powers of government is a democracy. He says the only way, and this is the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, he said, it's the only way we can do it, is to have a democracy. It's the only thing that makes sense. Plato was wrong. But he said, and if we think the people not enlightened enough to use discretion, the remedy is not to take this freedom from them, but to inform their discretion through education. And he said this is the only true corrective of the abuses of constitutional power. If he were alive today, he would say the same thing. When I read the Facebook threads, I get sad, and I think how stupid are people, and how angry and bitter everyone is, and how divided we are as a people. How do we solve this problem? There are some wanting to define the country for others, and others feeling this is the best, etc., etc. Well, how do we solve the problem? Well, Jefferson said the answer is not to take freedom away. The answer is actually to educate people better. That's part of why this is a required course. You got to start, we have to think about these things. Okay. Now, sadly, Rousseau didn't actually practice what he preached. He sent his own children to orphanages. Most died at a young age. He viewed women as naturally inferior to men. And he was generally disagreed with by most of his contemporaries. So even though he had these awesome ideas, he didn't actually live by them himself. Now, it would be unfair if we didn't discuss women in the Enlightenment as well. It wasn't just a bunch of smart men who abused their wives. In fact, there were quite a few noted female intellectuals. One of the most notable was Maria Winkelmann in Germany. She was an outstanding astronomer. Even though she was one of the foremost astronomers in the country of Germany, when she applied for a position as an assistant astronomer at the Berlin Academy, she was denied the post because the members of the Academy feared hiring her would be an embarrassment. It would set a precedent, and they actually, and I quote, they said mouths would gape. Essentially, what would people say if we hire a woman? So again, even though we're calling these people enlightened philosophs, there's a long ways to go. Now, female thinkers in the 18th century generally disagreed with this attitude and offered suggestions on how to improve these conditions. The most outspoken of these women was an English writer, Mary Wollstonecraft, and she is the founder of modern feminism. Her most famous work is called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, written in 1792. And Wollstonecraft pointed out two contradictions in the views of women held by people such as Rousseau. For example, again, if you're a reader of the New Testament, I'm sure you've heard the phrases, wives, submit to your husbands. Maybe you've even heard some of the lesser cited passages of 1 Corinthians 11:7, for example, that says that wives are to remain silent in the churches. And if they have questions, let them ask their husbands at home. And so it's forbidding public speaking even for women. And so Wollstonecraft challenged these ideas and said that to argue that women must obey men was contrary to the beliefs of those same individuals that a system based on the arbitrary power of monarchs over their subjects or slave owners over their slaves was wrong. Essentially, she's saying, why are you calling slavery evil and then treating me like a slave? It's messed up. She makes an excellent point. She said the subjugation of women to men was equally wrong. Furthermore, the Enlightenment was based on an ideal of reason innate in all human beings. And if women have reason, then they should have the same rights as men to obtain an education, to engage in economic and even political life. And of course, this today is considered equality. But she was considered extreme. All right, so today we'll be talking about economic changes and the social order. In particular, we're going to be looking at economic patterns. And among the economic patterns that I wanted to start with was population growth, particularly looking at Europe. So last week we were talking all about China and how China experienced this same type of rapid population growth. Europe began to experience this around 1750. And their population continued to increase steadily. Now, by 1700, the total population was around 120 million. And notice this, by 1750, just 50 years later, that number had jumped to 190 million. Not quite as much as what we're seeing in China, but there are still some reasons we need to look at for this rapid population growth. Perhaps of greatest significance is a lowering of the death rate. Europe had just experienced the bubonic plague, so perhaps peak death rate at that time had already passed. And another reason we need to look at was perhaps the diet. Similar to China, with the greater availability of food, coupled with better transportation of food, led to just the fact that people were able to eat better and gain better access to food. Now, making this possible were a number of agricultural innovations. For example, in Britain and parts of France, food production increased as more land was being made available to farm, and through some new techniques such as crop rotation, yields per acre increased dramatically. But also the climate was changing, so there were a number of factors beyond these people's control. We also see at this time the cultivation of a lot of new vegetables coming from the New World, particularly American crops like potatoes and corn. I can't stress how important it is that corn and potatoes came from the New World into Europe. Those crops will grow practically anywhere in difficult climates. And potatoes, literally, you throw them in a basement and forget about them, and they start growing. They will grow practically anywhere. Same with corn. It'll grow in very poor soil. And that was revolutionary, allowing for more crops per acre, allowing for more land to be farmed, and generally increasing the availability of food for the common person. We also see at this time an industrial revolution. Textiles and the cottage industry. Now, in European industry in the 18th century, textiles were the most important product. Now, again, textiles coming mainly from cotton, going through a manufacturing process. It's at this time that we see the mass production of clothing for the very first time. And this does a number of things. For one, it begins to make the old system of making all clothes at home obsolete. And it also begins to put Western Europe on the market in a big way in terms of exporting manufactured goods. So not only does this make manufactured clothing more available to the average consumer, but it also allows for entrepreneurs, which is a French word meaning undertake, or personal investors, to invest into factories and the factory production of clothing, which is going to experience a huge boom at this time. And so these entrepreneurs are going to sell these finished products, which are textiles, and they're going to reap a much better profit than they would just selling cotton. Bottom line, clothing is worth a heck of a lot more than cotton. Now, this system became known as the cottage industry because often, while we're seeing the mechanization of production here, a lot of it is still being done in people's homes through spinning weaves and looms. But we also see, as a result of this, a growth in a global economy and overseas trade. For example, overseas trade boomed throughout the 18th century, meaning the 1700s. Some talk of this as the emergence of really a true global economy, thanks to advances in sailing, such as the caravel, technologies helping with navigation that I've discussed previously in the chapter. This led to a time of overseas exploration. And thanks to colonies in the New World producing an abundance of raw materials, these things are able to be turned into finished products very cheaply in Western Europe through these factories. And again, this is going to make for a huge boom economically. Another important thing to look at when studying this boom time for Western Europe is the influx of gold and silver from Spain as a result of their overseas American empire. Much of this gold and silver made its way to Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands in exchange for these manufactured goods. British, Dutch, and French merchants in turn used the profits from the sale of these manufactured goods to buy tea, spices, silk, and cotton, other raw materials from other parts of the world. So this economic boom is so significant, we call it the Industrial Revolution, a profound change in society at this time. We also begin to see new opportunities for people. For example, commercial capitalism. See, commercial capitalism created enormous prosperity for some of these European countries. In fact, by 1700, Spain and Portugal and the Dutch, which had earlier controlled overseas trade, found themselves competing for business. with countries such as France and England, who had also begun to build profitable overseas empires. Now in American history, you would get more into the study of the colonies as they transitioned towards independence, but the 7 Years' War was an extremely important and significant event. Britain versus France fighting, much of it bled over into the American colonies, and it was a massive defeat for France. In fact, the result was that France effectively gave up control of their North American empire. And it would be a matter of time before America would acquire the Louisiana Purchase and France would give up claims in the New World altogether. But it also has a very profound effect when thinking about American motivations for leaving Great Britain. But that's something we'll come back to at a later time in terms of revolutions. So next, we're going to be looking at European society in the 18th century and a little social organization. See, Europe's social organization, first established in the Middle Ages, continued well into the 18th century. Society was still very much divided into traditional orders or estates, a rigid social structure. So if you ever study the Middle Ages, you have peasants, you have merchants, you have nobles, the church, and royalty. Now, most people were peasants. In fact, about 85% of Europe's population would have fallen into this category. There were rarely wide differences economically within this group. However, if you were a free serf, that meant you could own land. That meant you could come and go. And yet, that to be distinguished with, you could be a serf attached to the land without your freedom, meaning you could not even leave your home village. In Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe, as well as Russia, serfs remained generally tied to the land of their noble landlords. They weren't even allowed to leave. They were essentially slaves. By contrast, peasants in Britain, in northern Italy, through Spain and France and some other areas of Western Germany were largely free to their own devices. They did have to pay taxes to the lord who offered them protection in return, but yet they could come and go as they pleased. And then we have the nobility. Nobles, while only 2 to 3% of the European population, played a dominating role in society. In fact, while they were only 2 to 3% of the population, generally, they owned most of the nation's wealth. Being born into the nobility automatically guaranteed someone a place at the top of the social order with its privileges and rights. Nobles, for example, were often exempt from forms of taxation. Now, they often collected taxes from the peasants and then passed them on to their superiors, but yet they often didn't have to pay taxes themselves. Now, since medieval times, landed aristocrats, meaning those nobles who owned great tracts of land, often functioned as military officers. For example, during the American Revolution, there was a French aristocrat who offered his military expertise and services to the American colonies. His name was Marquis de Lafayette. He was extremely wealthy. He had nothing better going on. He believed in the American cause, and he had a lifetime worth of military training, and so he just came while the army was camped at Valley Forge and said, "Hey, I'd like to join your team, help you fight." And they said, "Sure, what else we got going on?" So there were a number of nobles like this. They were expected to be the officer corps of their countries. But another important change we see at this time is the growth of cities. While townspeople were still a minority of the population, except with a few exceptions, such as in the Dutch Republic or Great Britain with Italy, with Rome or London. We do see several emerging cities at this time. Most people lived in the countryside, and most people still lived an agrarian life as farmers. But by the end of the 18th century, so kind of latter half of the 1700s, about 1/6 of the French population was living in towns or cities. And this is a big change. In fact, this is really the first time in the history of these small countries that we see a significant portion of people living in cities. The biggest city in Europe was London. In fact, the second biggest city in the British Empire, there was London, and then there was Philadelphia in the United States, or what would become the United States. London at this time was bigger than Paris. London at this time was even bigger than Rome. And then finally, as far as social structure, we have patricians. The patricians were extremely wealthy individuals with such great sums of wealth that they held an enormous amount of power. In fact, many cities in Western and even Central Europe had a long tradition of patrician oligarchies. That means that the very wealthy ruled, meeting in small groups to determine the fates of the people of their city. And they dominated town city councils. Now, just below the patricians in these cities stood the upper crust of the middle class, the extremely wealthy merchants, non-nobles, not born into nobility, but had made a living for themselves, bankers and merchants, and those wealthy enough to rent property or to live off investments. And these people typically made up the ruling class of cities. And then finally we have in cities a lower middle class, people making a living, made up often of skilled workers, owners of small businesses, and then small tradespeople. And then below them were the working class, which consisted of most of the population of a city. So moving on into the West Indies. The first colonial empires in the Americas had been established in the 16th century by Spain and Portugal. But yet by the early 1600s, the Dutch and the English and the French were also establishing colonies in the New World. And kind of a generic name for this New World, what we call now the Americas, was the West Indies at this time because of the old tradition of the mistaken discovery of the westward route to India, which was in fact the continent of North America. Now, both the French and the British had colonial empires in the Americas, including parts of what we're calling the West Indies and the Caribbean, these chains of islands. The British held the islands of Barbados and Jamaica, as well as Bermuda. The French possessed Saint-Dominique, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. These were all tropical islands, and they were established as plantations where these colonial empires could grow large quantities of cotton, rice, tobacco, and sugar, things that need a high degree of humidity and a lot of heat and a large labor population and a long growing season to function. For example, sugar. These, quote, sugar factories, as they were often called in the Caribbean, played an extremely prominent role. Now, by the 1780s, Jamaica was one of Britain's most profitable colonies. In fact, they were able to produce 50,000 tons of sugar every year. And yet Jamaica possessed a population of 200,000 slaves that would later win their freedom. In fact, Jamaica declared its independence from Great Britain around the same time that America did. Jamaica was a slave colony where the slaves actually rose up successfully and declared their own independence. Now, the most famous French colony in the New World is what we now call Haiti. The French called it Saint-Dominique. Had roughly 500,000 slaves working on 3,000 different plantations throughout the island of Haiti. 500,000 slaves. In fact, the slaves so greatly outnumbered non-slaves there that, like Jamaica, the people of Haiti also rose up and sought their freedom. And this was so significant because while the French were trying to maintain and decide if they wanted to continue the investment of an overseas empire, when Haiti rose up and rebelled, that actually proved to be the last straw, and France began to withdraw and, for example, sold off the Louisiana Purchase to the United States to fund campaigns in Western Europe. But this colony, prior to their revolutions, was producing 100,000 tons of sugar every year. In fact, 40% of the world's sugar was coming from these plantations, but at great expense. You see, slaves treated on these plantations were treated terribly, and there was a high death rate as a result. So again, the first successful slave uprising was in Haiti in 1793. But next, the British in North America. Although the Spanish had laid claim to all of North America, that was only in theory. Most nations actually ignored that idea. There's a famous treaty called the Treaty of Tordesillas, where Spain made an agreement with Portugal to divide up the New World along an imaginary line. No one actually listened to it. Britain and France and the Dutch, meanwhile, were mainly focusing on North American colonies. The first permanent English settlement in North America was established at Jamestown. It's a fascinating story. The first few generations of people that were sent there died off. They were starving. They were barely surviving. But they did eventually become successful and are what we call is the state of Virginia today. It was actually established by a company called the Virginia Company. Well, anyway, while the settlers barely survived, colonizing and European nations quickly discovered that colonizing North American colonies, that this part of our world was just not as profitable as these Caribbean plantations. But nonetheless, people came here and they settled in large numbers. And perhaps the next American colony worth focusing on is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. While the Virginia Company established Jamestown in the hope of reaping huge profits, maybe discovering gold, maybe discovering raw materials, precious minerals, etc., and they didn't. They didn't find any of that. Massachusetts was founded and settled often by pilgrims coming to escape religious persecution. In fact, they did quite well. Of the initial 4,000 settlers who moved there in the early 1600s, by 1660, that number had increased to 40,000 settlers. So where Jamestown had the problem of its people dying off constantly, disease, sickness, Native Americans, etc., the Massachusetts Bay Colony did quite well. In fact, by the end of the 1700s, as I'm sure you've heard, Britain had 13 American colonies. And these would become the original 13 states. They were densely populated for their time, and roughly 1.5 million British subjects lived in the American colonies in 1750, and did relatively well comparatively, especially when you consider the massive poverty and the social disparity of the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, and how people could come here and start over with a relative abundance of land and an enormous amount of personal freedom. Now into French North America. The French also established a colonial empire in America. In about 1534, the French explorer Jacques Cartier, discovered the St. Lawrence River and claimed Canada as a French possession. In fact, the province of Quebec still speaks French largely as a result of this French colony. However, in the mid-1600s, Canada was made the property directly of the French crown, administered directly by a French governor and considered to be a province of France. But France had a problem. They had a difficult time persuading people to immigrate to Canada. And as a result, Quebec was very, very thinly populated. It's a huge province with not that many people living there. It has a colder climate, perhaps, than France would, and it's so distant from France that people had to realize they were leaving their homes forever. And so they had a difficult time persuading people to come over. And so in 1713, the French began to sell some of their American possessions to Great Britain. In fact, by the time of the American Revolution, Quebec belonged to Britain. It was a British possession. And after the 7 Years' War, France would give up all of their territorial possessions except for what would later be purchased by the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. And really the only reason they didn't have to give that up is because no one was trying to lay claim to it at that time. But now on to the American Revolution. By the mid-18th century, due to increasing trade and industry and a growing middle class in Britain that favored the expansion of trade and a world empire, British subjects began to come over to the American colonies in great numbers. Britain was doing quite well at the colonial game. In fact, by the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain controlled effectively all of North America. And all of this land was available for the densely crowded British subjects to come and start a new life. And it was quite attractive to many British subjects, and many did come and move to America and start a new life. But there are some important cultural differences between Great Britain and what is today the United States or the American colonies at that time. For example, the American colonists and the British people had different conceptions of how the empire should be governed. But after a time known as the Glorious Revolution, which I got into previously, and you can watch it later, the king and parliament agreed to share power, and parliament would be democratically elected. The monarch could choose, the king could choose ministers or advisors, and they could influence parliament, but yet parliament had the power to make laws. And even the king had to obey these laws. And they had the power to levy taxes or to raise funds. And they had the power really to influence the king and in a way tell him what to do. And so this was Great Britain's, it's called the Glorious Revolution, this was Great Britain's trend toward democracy. Now the British, well, eventually Parliament became their legislative form of government. The king and queen are just a figurehead, and the royal family is just something we watch on television when they have babies and get married, but we don't actually do what they say. In Britain, their system of government is very similar to ours, where the prime minister is the executive, parliament as the legislative, and then they have a judicial branch that interprets the laws, just like our Supreme Court. But where they began to run into problems with the American colonies was the issue of how to raise funds. Parliament was meant to represent all British subjects. There was a bicameral legislature called the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords, mainly consisting of the nobility, and the House of Commons meant to send representatives from every part of British society, meaning even the poor. But the real trouble with Americans is they didn't get to send a representative to Parliament. They had no voice in the laws that were being passed and the laws that affected them. And, you know, because of Britain's willingness to live and let live, a policy they called salutary neglect, because of their willingness to allow colonists to kind of do their own thing as long as they made money for the empire, all was fine. You know, the American colonists continued to ship large degrees of raw materials over to Britain. Britain, in turn, traded these for finished products, etc., and all was fine until the 7 Years' War. Now, the 7 Years' War was a disastrous war for all involved. Roughly 1 million people died. It was terrible. And after this war, Britain needed money, and they had to raise funds. And they had to do this by levying taxes that, yes, would include the American colonists. And so, long story short, as a result of these several taxes, we declared our independence. We called these taxes every sort of bad name you can think of. And we said, we don't want to pay them anymore unless you're going to give us representation in Parliament. Britain said no. We said, you better. They said no. We declared our independence. And then after several years of fighting, of course, they recognized their independence at the Treaty of Paris. And this began the American nation. And this, of course, is what we call the American Revolution. And another tricky point with the American Revolution is how then now do we set this up? You know, again, great in theory, we are now independent. But what does that mean? And so for about a 5-year, 6-year period, America existed under what was called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation were essentially a disaster. We tried to set up a system in where every state was considered a sovereign political entity independent of the other states. And there would be a loosely defined central government in legislative form only. And this legislative government would be consisting of representatives, one representative per colony, so 13 people, and each of them had to agree unanimously on anything, for anything to be done. And yet it was the job of this legislature to declare war, to levy taxes, to make laws, to keep up foreign relations, you name it. It was their job to do anything at the national level. And yet they couldn't do anything unless they all agreed. And so it was a mess. And it dissolved. Well, finally, after a farmer actually started a rebellion that was large enough to almost destroy our new country, his name was Daniel Shea, he started a rebellion, guess why? Because of taxes. And because his rebellion almost worked, it was finally put down by the Massachusetts militia. But because his rebellion almost worked, our founding fathers got back together. Everybody had this big meeting called the Constitutional Convention. And they said, we got to come up with a better idea. There's got to be something better than the Articles of Confederation. And so, of course, what was agreed upon is the amazing document that we have now called the United States Constitution. It established a central government with 3 main branches, of course, an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. And that's what we call federalism, or a division of powers, also between the states and the federal government. And so what the U.S. Constitution established was an effective way to govern and maintain national unity while at the same time respecting the sovereign rights of each state. And it's the best we've come up with so far. There were a number of people who didn't want to sign the Declaration of Independence. There are actually quite a few states that held out and refused until a Bill of Rights was included. Because a lot of the people that were leading the American Revolution just simply didn't trust the government. They had seen the abuses of the crown. They had seen the abuses of monarchs and various corrupt powers throughout the history of Western Europe. And so they didn't trust a government that would be involved in their lives. And so many refused to sign any form of constitution, any form of national unity, until the Bill of Rights was included. And I don't have time to go into it, but you should so read the Bill of Rights and be aware of these rights that are so, so important. It's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, if you're not aware. The Constitution was set up, as well as the Declaration of Independence, on these ideas called natural rights. And that's the philosophy of John Locke, that people are imbued with rights from their Creator. These rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's just paraphrasing from the Declaration of Independence, which, of course, was a paraphrase from John Locke.
He said life was in pursuit of happiness.
Now, you really should go back and watch or read the section on the Enlightenment. It's an amazing time period to study. And these philosophers and these scientists are very, very interesting people. You know, your book discusses Galileo and Copernicus, of course, John Locke, of course, Rene Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, a number of thinkers that were instrumental in these revolutionary concepts. In fact, the American Revolution was not unique, and it was not isolated. In fact, many different colonies were beginning to revolt and rebel against their colonial powers. And the Enlightenment, meaning particularly these thinkers that were espousing these ideas that we have natural rights, that government is a social contract, that the people empower the government with the right to rule and not God. That's a big idea with the Enlightenment, is that government exists with consent of the governed. So this idea here is just profound. A lot of these people call themselves Philosophs, and they believe in these natural rights that should not be withheld from any person. And the Bill of Rights speaks to these in great detail. For example, equality before the law, freedom of religious worship, freedom of speech and the press, and the rights to assemble and hold property and to pursue happiness. And, again, when you read the Bill of Rights, it's inspirational. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that equality didn't mean all at this time. Though it does establish kind of the foundation of egalitarianism, even though it really only applied to white male property owners at this time. And even though we still had slavery, and even though women weren't allowed to vote, and, typically we're supposed to remain silent in public, and we really weren't egalitarian at all, but I guess it establishes it on paper. And it's going to become the legal basis for the civil rights movement, which you could argue has always been going on. That people have always been pushing for greater freedoms and rights. But really, the Constitution does give that kind of de jure basis, that foundational motivation for the civil rights movement, which is really still going on. But the question is, how were these natural rights to be established? If we can all agree that all people are created equal, if we can all agree that the government gets its power from the governed, and that government is a social contract, an arrangement where people willingly give up aspects of their own personal freedom in exchange for a peaceful and prosperous society. But again, the real question is, how do we make that work? Well, it's a beautiful theory. How do we see it in practice? And what a lot of people thought, in fact, if you read Plato's Republic, he had the same idea of what he called the Enlightened Despot. I kid you not, the conclusion of Plato's grand work, The Republic, wasn't democracy. In fact, he had very negative things to say about democracy. He believed that an enlightened philosopher king who was wealthy enough to not need money or power was the way to go. Now, I'm not advocating despotism. I'm not advocating absolutism at all. But a lot of people of this time period certainly did. And these enlightened despots, or beneficent monarchs, as they like to think of themselves this way. There were a number of people who would have considered themselves in this camp, such as Frederick II of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph II of Austria. You could even argue Peter the Great thought he was this enlightened despot, this wise, beneficent ruler who only wanted what was best for their subjects. Of course, we have to question that, just the veracity of that style of thinking. History has shown us what absolute power can do in the hands of anybody, and when you have no one to answer to, that can create any number of problems. But this was still the going theory of what worked. But again, I hope history has proved otherwise. Okay, so let's explore some of these enlightened despots. For example, Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was arguably the most highly educated and most cultured monarchs of the 18th century. He was extremely well read. He had read his Locke, his Hobbes, his Rousseau, his certainly Plato, certainly the classics, etc. In fact, Voltaire, who was a satirist of the time, meaning a comedian who poked fun at the politics of the time, was invited to live at the court of this guy. And this is where he wrote a number of his works. Frederick the Great, as an enlightened absolutist or as a monarch, did believe himself to be the, quote, first servant of the state. He believed in being a conscientious ruler. Though perhaps one of his greatest accomplishments was that he expanded the Prussian army to a very large standing army of 200,000, and he kept a strict watch over his government. But for quite some time, he was actually known as a reformer. For example, during his rule, he abolished the use of torture, except in treason, as well as murder cases. So you could still beat the truth out of people if they did really bad things. And he even granted a limited degree of freedom of speech in the press, as well as complete religious toleration. However, he still retained the status of an absolute ruler. Next are the Austrian Empire, ruled by the Habsburgs. The Austrian Empire had become one of Europe's great states by the beginning of the 18th century. Yet it proved difficult to rule because when you look at the Austrian Empire, you're looking at a large number of ethnicities and languages and religions and different ways of life. And it's those things that naturally unify people that Austria just didn't have. A large number of ethnicities, a large number of spoken languages, of religions, of cultures, etc. And so, perhaps one of the most famous rulers of the Austrian Empire is Joseph II. He believed in the need to sweep away anything standing in the path of reason. Famous quote from Joseph II, he said, and I quote, "I have made philosophy the lawmaker of my empire. Her logical applications are going to transform Austria." And his reform programs, to be fair, were very far-reaching. He abolished serfdom. He abrogated the death penalty, meaning that it would only be used in extreme cases. And he established the principle of equality of all before the law, which really we wouldn't have until the 14th Amendment passed in roughly 1865. So in some ways, though he was, again, a monarch, not elected by the people, he was ruling absolutely. He didn't mess with this guy. But he made some reforms that are significant, which is why we call these people the Enlightened Despots. Joseph instituted drastic religious reforms as well, including complete and total religious toleration. So he took what in some countries of the time was a very problematic issue, meaning a diversity of faiths, and he nullified it by saying, you know what? By decree, you've got to be tolerant of other ideas and faiths. And again, dude's an enlightened despot. He can throw you in jail at the whim of his word. But he made some progressive actions. In fact, many of his programs were just seen as a bit too much, a bit too far forward for Austria. He wound up alienating a number of the nobility by freeing the serfs, who were their labor force, and he alienated the church by his attacks on the establishment of religion and its close ties with the state. And so the church didn't like the fact that they were losing power because he decreed tolerance of religions. And, of course, the nobility didn't like the fact that they were losing power because they lost their forced labor force. So Joseph realized his failure when he wrote on his epitaph, which is on his gravestone, and I quote, "Here lies Joseph II, who was unfortunate in everything he undertook," even though he was the most famous ruler of the Austrian Empire. Okay, the next enlightened despot that we're going to look at is Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was a highly intelligent woman. She was also very well read and versed in the ideas of these times. And she, like Frederick the Great, was very skeptical of impractical theories. She did consider the idea that a new code of law would recognize the principle of equality of all people. But in the end, she actually didn't go through with it. Because she knew, and she lived around the same time as Joseph II, ruler of the Austrian Empire. She knew that to free the serfs would alienate the nobility and lead to the collapse of her power. So like many politicians, she just didn't touch this issue because she knew it would be political suicide. Like many before her, she gave the nobles a charter that exempted them from taxes And so in many ways, she did continue policies of her predecessors. Typically, her policies of favoring the nobility led to even worse conditions for the Russian peasants and finally sparked a peasant uprising, which soon collapsed. Above all, Catherine did prove to be a worthy successor to Peter the Great in terms of expanding territory. Russia did spread southward, and Russia's expansion westward did finally encapsulate Poland, which, if you know much about the Second World War, Poland was a big focal point of why this became a global conflict, because Poland had been taken from Russia in a previous conflict, and Stalin hoped to retake this territory, and it was at that time that the World War began. But anyway, so during the reign of Catherine the Great, Poland was conquered without a world war, so that's worth saying. So, of the rulers we've discussed so far, only Joseph II truly sought radical changes based on the Enlightenment. The others continued the policies of their predecessor. Frederick II and Catherine II both liked to talk about these ideas, but they never really attempted them. Neither ruler's policies seemed to be seriously affected by this revolutionary fervor that we see so much of in the colonies and so much of in Great Britain at this time. Because really the practicalities of maintaining an effective state took precedence over reforming and making the people's lives better. So perhaps stability, in their opinion, would have trumped progress. Now, many historians maintain that Joseph and Frederick and Catherine were all primarily concerned for power and the well-being of their states. In fact, increasing their power might have been Joseph II's motives. Julius Caesar thought he was a man of the people, thought he was being progressive, and used that influence with the poor to gain power and declared himself emperor, of course, until they stabbed him to death. But anyway, at the same time, the ability of enlightened rulers to make reforms was limited by political and social realities, like I've said. Okay. As far as global confrontations go, 7 Years' War is arguably the first true world war, the first real global conflict. It was certainly the most dramatic for its time. Although the war began in Europe as yet another conflict between Britain and France, it of course bled over into the American colonies, and like I said previously, was a big reason why the American Revolution occurred anyway. But in Europe, the British and the Prussians were fighting the Austrians and the Russians and the French, and so these tangled alliances were leading to complicated conflicts. Frederick the Great, allied with Prussia, Frederick the Great of Prussia, was able to defeat for a time the Austrians and the French and the Russians, but eventually his forces were worn down until a Russian Tsar eventually withdrew Russia's troops from the conflict. And this resulted in the stalemate in the European conflict, but the struggle between Britain and France over the territories in the New World continued and was certainly more decisive. For example, the conflicts that took place in North America did involve colonists, did involve Native Americans, and were pitting all on both sides. But ultimately, in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the French acknowledged the victory of the British. And for France, the loss of this empire was shortly after followed by an even greater upheaval. The French Revolution would come shortly after the American Revolution.
Fearful
So the
of
French
power
Revolution.
structure they see emerging,
In 1789,
to organize
the United States began. The Constitution was ratified. George Washington was elected our first president. And it was that same year that France experienced its revolution.
Secretary of State,
and after
Jefferson
centuries
was
of
in
warfare
Paris at the
and
beginning
more
of the French
recent
Revolution.
conflicts such as the
And he was
7
very
Years'
close with
War,
some of
the
the
French
French
peasantry was
revolutionary
impoverished
leaders in the
and
very
starving.
first stage
Maybe
of
you've
the
heard the
French
phrase,
Revolution.
let them eat cake.
When
That
the French
was
Revolution turned into the Jacobin
famous
phase and the terror
Marie
and so, he
Antoinette,
was
right?
very
Famous last
reluctant
words, let them
to
eat
give up
cake.
the idea that this was a
Her
great
advisors were approaching her
idealistic
saying,
fulfillment
the
of
people
the
are starving,
Enlightenment.
we don't have
And
food,
consequently,
we don't have
he
grain.
became
And
embroiled
her
in
response was, they
politics
can eat cake
with the
then if they don't have
Federalists
grain.
who
Of course,
saw
they didn't have cake. Well, anyway,
sheer
they became
tyranny and
starving to the
savagery
point of
in the French
desperation.
Revolution,
And the
which,
French
above
Revolution was
all,
far
they
more
wanted to
violent
avoid.
than the American Revolution. In fact, it
Hamilton
closely resembles
suggested
some of
that
these
perhaps
slave
the French
uprisings where the
treaty
very
was no
poor,
longer in force,
in
because the old French
desperation,
government didn't exist.
struck against the very
In
wealthy
response, Republicans
at the roots
said,
of their society.
France continues to exist. Its form of
in
government
fact,
is not critical to
the
our
population
obligations to the people
of
France.
France was divided
So
into
the stakes
three
were extremely
rigid
high. This was not
social
gratuitous
orders.
thinking
Of course,
about
you have the
somebody
first
else's
estate, the
problems.
clergy, meaning the
Specifically,
church,
the problems
a
had to
very
do
small
with
percentage of
who
the
would the
people,
Americans
yet
trade with,
owned
who would
approximately
protect American
10%
commerce.
of all the
The
land in
Federalists
France.
increasingly argued that it was necessary to come to terms
The
with
clergy,
British.
of course, were exempt
Of course,
from any form of
Republicans
taxation
responded that this
and
was a
had
question
become
of
extremely
principle,
powerful.
and that
10%
free
of the
people
land
across the world
owned
had to
by
join arms.
roughly
There were good arguments on both
130,000
sides.
people.
They divided
That's
the
not a
American
lot
political
in terms of the
public,
entire country.
deeply,
Second estate was the
and
nobility.
set the stage
There were
for
roughly
the great
350,000
troubles of the late
nobles,
1790s.
and these people owned 25 to
Despite strong pressure
30%
from his
of all
admirers,
the land in France.
George Washington insists on
And then, of
retiring
course,
from
you have
office
the third
in
estate, or
1797,
commoners.
after
This
two
is where the
terms
term
as
third
president.
world comes from as
In his
well.
farewell address to the nation, Washington reinforces his belief in a strong national government.
And remember especially that for the efficient management of your common interests in a country so extensive as ours, a government of as much vigor as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. Liberty itself will find in such a government, with powers properly distributed and adjusted, its surest guardian.
The third estate, or commoners, constituted the overwhelming majority of the French population. They were divided, of course, by vast differences because we're talking about most of the people, 90% or more of France's population. And these peasants, consisting of a large portion of the population, owned by far the smallest portion of wealth in France. 80% of the people owned roughly 35% of the land, and the rest was controlled by your one percenters. And so this is economic disparity to an alarming degree. While serfdom no longer existed in a large scale by this time, French peasants still had obligations to their local landlords, and there were certain relics of feudalism and privileges of the wealthy and nobility that just grated on people. Another part of the third estate consisted of skilled craftspeople, shopkeepers, small business owners, and all of these groups suffered economically throughout the 1700s, partly because of inflation, due to, again, constant warfare and terrible policies enacted on them by the nobility. And this desperation, this daily struggle, is going to be one of the most important causes of this revolution. So while taxation without representation seemed to be the motivating cause in the American Revolution, starvation and desperation was the main motivating cause in the French Revolution. And this is going to make theirs a lot more violent. Meanwhile, when when the French monarchy was ruling over a time of economic progress, nobody really cared who was in power. Nobody really bothered with it. And while France was enjoying 50 years of economic expansion, bad harvests in the winters or the falls of 87 and 1788, as well as the beginning of a manufacturing depression, resulting in food shortages and increased prices of food and other goods, rising numbers of unemployment in the cities. Again, it's this desperation which is going to be the primary cause. The French monarchy seemed to be incapable of dealing with these new social challenges. In fact, Louis XVI became king in 1774 at the age of 20. He knew very little about how to rule at all, and really lacked the desire and the energy to deal with these affairs decisively. His wife, Marie Antoinette, I've already told you about, and as these crises worsened, neither the king nor his queen seemed to be able to understand just the depths of desperation and despair, because they lived a life of luxury while most of their people were starving. And so the French economy continued to decline and to decline. And the French government continued to pursue aggressive policies based on territorial expansion. Constant warfare led to greater French government expenditures. Finally, on the verge of a complete financial collapse, the government of Louis XVI was forced to call a meeting of the Estates General, the French legislature body. And they had not actually been invited to meet for over 100 years. And at this meeting, representatives were there from all three orders of French society. And the government had rules that the third estate, representing the poor, was supposed to get double representation, because really it constituted 97% of the population. But the third estate had representatives who were mostly made up of wealthy Frenchmen. So really this meeting was a sham. And so the beginning of the collapse of the French monarchy. The National Assembly. The Estates General opened at Versailles on May 5th of 1789. The first issue was whether voting should be by order or by head, each delegate having one vote. Traditionally, each order would vote as a group and have one vote. That meant that the first and second estates could outvote the third estate 2-1. The third estate demanded that each deputy have one vote. Now, with the assistance of liberal nobles and clerics, that would give the third estate a majority. But when the first estate declared in favor of voting by order, the third estate responded dramatically. On June 17th of 1789, the third estate declared itself the, quote, National Assembly and prepared to draw up a constitution. This was the first step in the French Revolution, because the third estate had no legal right to act as the National Assembly. Louis XVI sided with the First Estate and prepared to use force to dissolve the Estates General. Storming of the Bastille. Common people, however, saved the Third Estate from the king's forces. On July 14th, a mob of Parisians stormed the Bastille, a royal armory, and proceeded to dismantle it brick by brick. Louis XVI was soon informed that the royal troops were unreliable. Louis's acceptance of that reality signaled the collapse of royal authority. The king could no longer enforce his will. Then there were peasant rebellions. At the same time, popular revolts broke out throughout France in the cities and the countryside. Behind the popular uprising was a growing resentment of the entire landholding system, with its fees and obligations. The fall of the Bastille and the king's apparent capitulation to the demands of the Third Estate now led peasants to take matters into their own hands. The peasant rebellions that occurred throughout France had a great impact on the National Assembly meeting at Versailles. The destruction of the old regime. The Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. One of the first acts of the National Assembly was to abolish the rights of landlords and the fiscal exemptions of nobles, clergy, towns, and provinces. 3 weeks later, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. This Charter of Basic Liberties proclaimed freedom and equal rights for all men and access to public office based on talent. All citizens were to have the right to take part in the legislative process. Freedom of speech and the press was coupled with the outlawing of arbitrary arrest. Olympe de gauche and women. But did the Declaration's ideal of equal rights for all men also include women? Many deputies insisted that it did, provided that, as one said, quote, "Women do not hope to exercise political rights and functions." Olympe de gauche, a playwright, refused to accept this exclusion of women from political rights. Echoing the words of the official declaration, she penned the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, in which she insisted that women should have the same rights as men. The National Assembly ignored her demands. Civil constitution of the clergy. Because the Catholic Church was seen as an important pillar of the old order, it too was reformed. Most of the lands of the church were seized. Under the civil constitution of the clergy, which was adopted on July 12th of 1790, bishops and priests were to be elected by the people and paid by the state. The Catholic Church, still an important institution in the life of the French people, now became an enemy of the Revolution. The Legislative Assembly. By 1791, the National Assembly had completed a new constitution that established a limited constitutional monarchy. There was still a monarch, now called King of the French. And by sovereign power was vested in the new Legislative Assembly which would make the laws. The Legislative Assembly was to sit for 2 years and consisted of 745 representatives elected by an indirect system that preserved power in the hands of the more affluent members of society. A small group of 50,000 electors chose the deputies. The Jacobins. Thus the old order had been destroyed, but the new order had many opponents: Catholic priests, nobles, and lower classes hurt by the rising cost of living, and peasants opposed to dues that had not been eliminated, and political clubs like the Jacobins that offered more radical solutions. The king also made things difficult for the new government when he sought to flee France in June of 1791, and almost succeeded before being recognized, captured, and brought back to Paris. In this unsettled situation, under a discredited and seemingly disloyal monarch, the new Legislative Assembly held its first session in 1791 of October. France's relations with the rest of Europe soon led to Louis's downfall. It's a war with Austria and Prussia. On August 27th of 1791, the monarchs of Austria and Prussia, fearing that revolution would soon spread to their countries, invited other European monarchs to use force to reestablish monarchical authority in France. The French fared badly in the fighting in the spring of 1792, and a frantic search for scapegoats began. As one observer noted, quote, "Everywhere you hear the cry that the king is betraying us, the generals are betraying us, that nobody is to be trusted, that Paris will be taken in 6 weeks by the Austrians. We are on a volcano, ready to spout flames." The monarchy was suspended. Defeats in war, coupled with economic shortages, led to renewed demonstrations, especially against the king. In August of 1792, radical political groups in Paris took the king captive and forced the Legislative Assembly to suspend the monarchy and call for a national convention, chosen on the basis of universal male suffrage, to decide on the future form of government. The French Revolution was about to enter a more radical stage. The Radical Revolution, the National Convention. In September of 1792, the newly elected National Convention began its sessions. Dominated by lawyers and other professionals, 2/3 of its deputies were under 45, and almost all had gained political experience as a result of the rebellion. The king executed. Almost all distrusted the king. As a result, the convention's first step on September 21st was to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic. On January 21st of 1793, the king was executed, and the destruction of the old regime was complete. But the execution of the king created new enemies for the revolution both at home and abroad. In Paris, the local government known as the Commune, whose leaders came from the working classes, favored radical change and put constant pressure on the convention, pushing it to ever more radical positions. Meanwhile, peasants in the West and inhabitants of the major provincial cities refused to accept the authority of the convention. A foreign crisis also loomed. By the beginning of 1793, after the king had been executed, most of Europe, an informal coalition of Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Britain, the Dutch Republic, and even Russia, aligned militarily against France. Grossly overextended, the French armies began to experience reverses, and by late spring, France was threatened with invasion. The Radical Revolution, a nation at arms. The Committee of Public Safety. To meet these crises, the convention gave broad powers to an executive committee of 12 known as the Committee of Public Safety, which came to be dominated by Maximilien Robespierre. For a 12-month period from 1793 to 1794, the Committee of Public Safety took control in France. To save the Republic from its foreign foes, on August 23rd of 1793, the committee decreed a levy en masse, or universal mobilization of the nation. Young men will fight. Young men are called to conquer. Married men will forge arms, transport military baggage and guns, and will prepare food supplies. Women who at long last are to take their rightful place in the revolution and follow their true destiny will forget their feudal tasks. Their delicate hands will work at making clothes for soldiers. They will make tents, and they will extend their tender care to shelters, where the defenders of the patrie, or nation, will receive the help that their wounds require. Children will make lint of old cloth. It is for them that we are fighting. Children, beings destined to gather all the fruits of the revolution, will raise their pure hands toward the skies. And old men, performing their missions again as of yore, will be guided to the public squares of the cities, where they will kindle the courage of young warriors and preach the doctrines of hate for kings and the unity of the republic. End quote. In less than a year, the French revolutionary government had raised an army of 650,000, and by 1795 it had pushed the Allies back across the Rhine and even conquered the Austrian Netherlands. The levy en masse and nationalism. The French Revolutionary Army was an important step in the creation of modern nationalism. Previously, wars had been fought between governments or ruling dynasties by relatively small armies of professional soldiers. The new French army was the creation of, quote, a people's government. Its wars were now people's wars, involving the entire nation. But when the dynastic wars became a people's war, warfare increased in ferocity and lack of restraint. The wars of the French Revolutionary era opened the door to the total war of modern war. The Reign of Terror. To meet the domestic crisis, the National Convention and the Committee of Public Safety launched the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary courts were instituted to protect the Republic from its internal enemies. In the course of 9 months, 16,000 people were officially killed under the blade of the guillotine, a revolutionary device designed for the quick and efficient separation of heads from bodies. Revolutionary armies were set up to bring recalcitrant cities and districts back under the control of the National Convention. The Committee of Public Safety decided to make an example of Sierrons, which had defied the authority of the National Convention. By April of 1794, some 1,880 citizens of Lyon had been executed, and when the guillotine proved too slow, cannon fire was used to blow condemned men into open graves. A German observed, "The churches, convents, and all the dwellings of the former patricians were in ruins. When I came to the guillotine, the blood of those who had been executed a few hours beforehand was still running in the street. I said to a group of radicals that it would be decent to clear away all this human blood. Why should it be cleared?" One of them said to me, "It's the blood of aristocrats and rebels. The dogs should look it up." Equality and slavery. Revolution in Haiti. Early in the French Revolution, the desire for equality led to a discussion of what to do about slavery. A club called Friends of the Blacks advocated the abolition of slavery, which was achieved in France in September of 1791. But French planters in the West Indies, who profited greatly from the use of slaves on the sugar plantations, opposed the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. On February 4th of 1794, however, the National Convention, guided by ideals of equality, abolished slavery in the colonies. Toussaint L'Ouverture. In one French colony, slaves had already rebelled. In 1791, black slaves in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, inspired by the revolution in France, revolted against French plantation owners. Led by Toussaint L'Ouverture, a son of African slaves, more than 100,000 black slaves rose in revolt and seized control of Hispaniola. Later, an army sent by Napoleon captured L'Ouverture, who died in captivity in France. But the French soldiers, weakened by disease, soon succumbed to the slave forces. On January the 1st of 1804, the western part of Hispaniola, now called Haiti, became the first independent state in Latin America. One of the French revolutionary ideals had triumphed abroad. Reaction and the Directory. Robespierre overthrown. By the summer of 1794, the French had been successful on the battlefield against their foreign foes, making the terror less necessary. But the terror continued because Robespierre, who had come to dominate the Committee of Public Safety, became obsessed with purifying the body politic of all the corrupt. Many deputies in the National Convention began to fear that they were not safe while Robespierre was free to act, and gathered enough votes to condemn him. Robespierre was guillotined on July 28th of 1794. The Directory. After the death of Robespierre, a reaction set in as more moderate middle-class leaders took control. The reign of terror came to a halt, and the National Convention reduced the power of the Committee of Public Safety. In August, a new constitution was drafted that reflected the desire for a stability that did not sacrifice the ideals of 1789. 5 directors, the Directory, acted as the executive authority. The period of the revolution under the Directory was an era of stagnation and corruption. At the same time, the Directory faced political enemies from both the left and the right of the political spectrum. On the right, the Royalists continued their efforts to restore the monarchy. On the left, radical hopes of power were revived by continuing economic problems. Battered from both sides, unable to solve the country's economic problems, and still carrying on the wars inherited from the Committee of Public Safety, the Directory increasingly relied on the military to maintain its power. This led to a coup d'etat in 1799, in which the popular military general Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon dominated both French and European history from 1799 to 1815. He had been born in Corsica in 1769, shortly after France had annexed the island. Young Napoleon Bonaparte, his birth name, was sent to France to study in one of the new military schools and was a lieutenant when the Revolution broke out in 1789. The Revolution and the European War that followed gave him new opportunities, and Napoleon quickly rose through the ranks. In 1794, at the age of only 25, he was a brigadier general. 2 years later, he commanded the French armies in Italy, where he won a series of victories and returned to France as a conquering hero. After a disastrous expedition to Egypt, Napoleon returned to Paris, where he participated in the coup that gave him control of France. He was only 30 years old. After the coup of 1799, a new form of the Republic called the Consulate was proclaimed, in which Napoleon, as first consul, controlled the entire executive authority of the government. He had overwhelming influence over the legislature, appointed members of the administrative bureaucracy, commanded the army, and conducted the foreign affairs. In 1802, Napoleon was made consul for life, and in 1804 he returned to France to monarchy when he became Emperor Napoleon I. Domestic policies. Peace with the Church. One of Napoleon's first domestic policies was to establish peace with the oldest and most implacable enemy of the Revolution, the Catholic Church. In 1801, Napoleon arranged a concordat with the Pope that recognized Catholicism as the religion of a majority of the French people. In return, the Pope agreed not to challenge the confiscation of church lands due to the Revolution. Equality before the law. Napoleon's most enduring domestic achievement was his codification of the laws. Before the Revolution, France had some 300 local legal systems. During the Revolution, efforts were made to prepare a single code of laws for the nation, but it remained for Napoleon to bring the work to completion in the famous Civil Code. It preserved most of the revolutionary gains by recognizing the equality of all citizens before the law, the abolition of serfdom and feudalism, and religious toleration. Property rights were also protected. A government of talent. Napoleon also developed a powerful centralized administration and worked hard to develop a bureaucracy of capable officials. Early on, the regime showed that it cared little whether officials had acquired their expertise in royal or revolutionary bureaucracies. Promotion, whether in civil or military offices, was based not on rank or birth, but on ability only. This principle of a government career open to talent was, of course, what many bourgeoisie had wanted before the Revolution. In his domestic policies, then, Napoleon both destroyed and preserved many aspects of the Revolution. Although equality was preserved in the law code and the opening of careers to talent, the creation of a new aristocracy, the strong protection accorded to property rights, and the use of conscription for the military made it clear that much equality had been lost. Liberty was replaced by an initially benevolent despotism that grew increasingly arbitrary. Napoleon shut down 60 of France's 73 newspapers. Napoleon's Empire. When Napoleon became consul in 1799, France was at war with the Second European coalition of Russia, Great Britain, and Austria. Napoleon realized the need for a pause and made a peace treaty in 1802. But in 1803, war was renewed with Britain, which was soon joined by Austria, Russia, and Prussia in the Third Coalition. In a series of battles from 1805 to 1807, Napoleon's Grand Army defeated the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies, giving Napoleon the opportunity to create a new European order, the Grand Empire, imposing revolutionary principles. From 1807 to 1812, Napoleon was the master of Europe. His Grand Empire was composed of three major parts: the French Empire, dependent states, and all allied states. Dependent states were under the rule of Napoleon's relatives. These came to include Spain, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Italy, the Swiss Republic, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and the Confederation of the Rhine, a union of all German states except Austria and Prussia. Allied states were those defeated by Napoleon and forced to join his struggle against Britain. These included Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Within his empire, Napoleon sought acceptance of certain revolutionary principles, including legal equality, religious toleration, and economic freedom. In the inner core and dependent states of his Grand Empire, Napoleon tried to destroy the old order. Nobility and clergy everywhere in these states lost their special privileges. He decreed the equality of opportunity with offices open to talent, equality before the law, and religious toleration. The continental system. Napoleon hoped that his grand empire would last for centuries, but it collapsed almost as rapidly as it had been formed. As long as Britain ruled the waves, it was not subject to military attack. Napoleon hoped to invade Britain, but he could not overcome the British Navy's decisive defeat of a combined French-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar in 1805. To defeat Britain, Napoleon turned to his continental system. An alliance put into effect between 1806 and 1808, it attempted to prevent British goods from reaching the European continent in order to weaken Britain economically and destroy its capacity to wage war. But the continental system failed. Allied states resented it. Some began to cheat, others to resist. Napoleon also encountered new sources of opposition. His conquests made the French hated oppressors and aroused the patriotism of the conquered people. A Spanish uprising aided by the British kept a French force of 200,000 pinned down for years. The fall of Napoleon, the invasion of Russia. The beginning of Napoleon's downfall came in 1812 with his invasion of Russia. The refusal of the Russians to remain in the continental system left Napoleon with little choice. Although aware of the risks involved in invading such a huge country, he knew that if the Russians were allowed to challenge the continental system unopposed, others would follow suit. In June of 1812, he led his grand army of more than 600,000 men into Russia. His hopes for victory depended on quickly defeating the Russian armies, but the Russian forces retreated and refused to give battle, torching their own villages to keep Napoleon's army from finding food. When the Russians did stop to fight at Bordeaux, Napoleon won an indecisive and costly victory: exile in Elba. This military disaster led other European states to rise up and attack the crippled French army. Paris was captured in March of 1814, and Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Elba off the coast of Italy. Meanwhile, the Bourbon monarchy was restored in the person of Louis XVIII, brother of the executed king. Napoleon, bored on Elba, slipped back into France. When troops were sent to capture him, Napoleon opened his coat and addressed them. "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, I am your emperor. Is there a man among you who would kill his emperor? Here I am." No one fired a shot. Shouting, "Vive! Emperor! Vive! Emperor!" the troops went over to his side, and Napoleon entered Paris in triumph on March 20th of 1815. The powers that had defeated him pledged once more to fight him. Napoleon raised another army and moved to attack the Allied forces stationed in what is now Belgium. At Waterloo, on June 18th, Napoleon met a combined British and Prussian army under the Duke of Wellington and suffered a bloody defeat. This time, the victorious Allies exiled him to St. Helena, a small forsaken island in the South Atlantic off the coast of Africa. Only Napoleon's memory
continue to haunt French political life.